think the reason we're here today is the history of America has really been one of having a K-12 system that is the envy of the world. And I think, unfortunately, over the last several decades, that has ceased to be true. There's a lot of different statistics that one can use to demonstrate that. Test scores have been flat for several decades. Spending has been up. College completion rates, we used to be #1 in the world. We're now, I guess, number 16 is the famous statistic. High school completion rates have roughly been flat for 25 or 30 years. Phil's going to tell us some about that. And I think the consequences of what has not been this decline in the American education system are revealing themselves in our society. We can see the unacceptable levels of inequality, the declining incomes for many American families, and that's why we're here today. And so we have a really fantastic panel. I'm going to introduce the discussants as soon as Phil is done. So for now, I thought I would just introduce Phil Oreopoulos, who we're very fortunate to have. He's a world expert on high school and college completion. Teaches at the University of Toronto, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his paper and his proposal. Phil.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm delighted to be part of this, and I want to thank the Hamilton Project, and particularly Michael Greenstone, Adam Looney, and Jeremy Potocnik for helping me out with this. And this paper report is joint with Derek Messakar. And I only have 7 minutes, so let me start right away. So, compulsory schooling, in particular, the minimum amount of time required to spend in school before being legally allowed to leave is often motivated by the possibility that youth who disengage from attending school may, in fact, be better off from staying on. So, here's some examples from New Jersey. A person who stops attending school at age 16 will always lack the skills and preparation to successfully compete in the workforce and function in society. From Maryland, it's symbolically important for state laws to indicate that kids shouldn't be leaving school before they receive a high school diploma. And from President Obama, when students are not allowed to drop out, they do better. So what's the evidence of this? Well, these laws have been around for a long time. In fact, some of them have been around for more than 100 years. And we can take advantage of that by looking at what happens, or what's happened, to individuals when these laws have changed. And many studies now have shown consistently and robustly that when compulsory schooling has been increased, we see that, on average, lifetime wealth has improved. And increasing compulsory schooling laws have been linked to many pecuniary and non-pecuniary outcomes that we may be interested in not just from an individual perspective, but from a societal perspective as well. These include lower unemployment, lower crime, lower teenage pregnancy, better health, and more civic participation in terms of higher likelihood to vote and more neighborhood trust. High school dropouts increasingly struggle in the workforce. On average, annual earnings over their lifetime don't exceed more than $30,000. Some states have responded in recent years by deciding to increase the school leaving age to 17 or 18. And we can again take advantage of these changes to see what has happened. And again, consistent with previous studies, later social economic outcomes have improved. High school completion rates have increased, and even college enrollment has increased, perhaps because the path to college becomes easier once overcoming the hurdle of high school graduation. The attainment impacts are moderate, in part because some of the law changes were not accompanied by resources to implement them. But for those affected, the increase in present value of lifetime earnings was, on average, about $100,000, easily offsetting the per pupil costs associated with more caseworkers and higher attendance. And that's not even taking into account the possibility of non-pecuniary benefits as well. So what might be going on here? If a teenager doesn't really want to go to school, why would nudging him to do so make him better off? There are many reasons, of course, for dropping out, but in general, it's helpful to think of it as a slow process of disengagement. The past studies I mentioned suggest that this disengagement occurs for some at the expense of long-term benefits later on. And it may come as no parent surprise that youth are particularly predisposed to impulsive behavior, especially when faced with immediate sacrifices for helping realize long-term and uncertain benefits. Focusing on a current dislike of school may lead to missing out on rewards in the future. Compulsory schooling laws provide also the opportunity and resources to address disengagement. The laws are not just about getting kids in school by imposing fines or penalties. When a child becomes truant under the minimum school leaving age, the first step is often a principal or a counselor contacting the child or parent to figure out solutions for increasing attendance. This report is based in large part on the facts that high school dropouts face enormous hardships in today's labor market, while past and recent studies have shown that these students would benefit, at least on average, from continuing with school. At the same time, administrators should try to address reasons for disengagement in the first place. We think policies to raise the school leaving age to 18 while allowing for some exceptions and while developing programs to re-engage at-risk youth would prove cost-effective strategies in fostering improved lifetime career outcomes. Some evidence-based strategies for addressing disengagement include coaching and guidance programs that address disengagement early, small classes for at-risk youth that combine academic curricula and real work experience, and setting high expectations while providing coaching and tutoring support for those who need it. We think the time is right for setting higher expectations for virtually all students to complete high school, and consider college given evidence of higher returns from doing so and increasingly competitive labor market conditions. Raising the school leaving age is a realistic policy for all states to consider. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, our first discussant we're very fortunate to have is to my left, Terry Grier. He has almost an unparalleled set of experiences in the American school systems. I'm going to try and get this right. I'm missing at least one. You were a superintendent of the Guilford County Public Schools.
Greensboro, North Carolina for 8 years.
For 8 years. Then you went to San Diego.
Yes.
You were there for 18 months.
Yep.
It's not that long.
Not that long.
You know, the weather there is very nice. And you went to Houston.
I've heard the weather
where the
there
weather is very pleasant in the summer.
Yes.
And so setting aside Terry's strange weather preferences, I thought we might ask him to talk a little bit about his experiences. And I believe in Guilford, I learned this morning, you had the lowest dropout rate of any big city school system. And,
sure.
And one thing I hope the whole panel will be able to address, so I have children, and you'd look at Phil's numbers and they're just astonishing. You're going to earn $15 an hour when you're age 50 if you drop out from high school. That's if you work. There's a good chance you'll be unemployed. There's 1 out of 25 are incarcerated. Why do people make these decisions, and how did you get them to change them?
Well, it's very hard. When a child decides to drop out of school, it's a hard decision. Some people think it's easy. It's one of the toughest decisions a kid's going to make in their lifetime when they really get to the point that they've decided to give up. Now, before I jump into saying a few things, it's about people. Houston's about people. It's the greatest city in the country. My wife and I love living there, and the weather doesn't equal San Diego's, but the people are fabulous. So it's interesting. In Houston in 2007, the dropout rate there was 22.5%. Today it's an 11.8% number. So we've cut it in half, as we did in Greensboro, North Carolina, and as we were beginning to do in San Diego. I think, first of all, it has to be a priority of the Board of Education and of the superintendent that those type of statistics just simply can't stand. And so to us, it's a focus. To us, we hold people accountable. We looked at it from a short-term and a long-term perspective. Long-term, we quickly realized that the kids that were dropping out of our high schools, regardless of whether it was in North Carolina, California, or Texas, simply most of them could not read. They're reading 2, 3, 4 grade levels below. So in all of those districts, and again here in Houston, this past year, all of our kindergarten, first and second grade teachers went through a 5-day reading program training where we trained them how to teach disenfranchised kids how to read. It's a different skill set if you're trying to teach a child that shows up in kindergarten with a 5,000 to 7,000 word vocabulary, who has some phonemic awareness, who understands colors and shapes, versus a child coming into kindergarten with a 1,500 to 2,000 word vocabulary with no other skill sets, where there's no books in the home and there's not much reading going on. And our colleges and universities simply are not preparing young teachers to address that particular problem. So that was a big issue with us long term. We got into our middle schools, and we quickly recognized that students that had been retained 2 or more times, the chances of them graduating from high school were just almost non-existent. So we went back and did a deep dive look into when children were being retained and what we had done for those kids prior to holding them back a year. That was quite revealing. Then at the high school level, when they got into high school, we established dropout intervention teams at each one of our high schools, and each time a child dropped out of school, that group met the same day or the next day and started looking at why that child dropped out and started developing and identifying patterns for us. We established in each one of these school systems where I work, Twilight High Schools. In Houston, we have 6. These are high schools that start at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, go to 7:30 at night, Monday through Thursday, and then all day on Saturday. So students that have to work to earn income for their family, or kids who are just 1 or 2 courses short that need to graduate, can come back to those schools in the evening and get credit recovery to graduate. Each one of our high schools, we started this in Guilford County back in 2001, and we've carried it all the way through California, San Diego, and down to Houston. We established dropout intervention courses in our high schools. We call them grad labs. The school district purchased a bank of laptop computers for each high school. We handpicked a graduation coach, and kids who had failed courses before, versus having to sit in a classroom and repeat the same thing over for 180 days with usually the same teacher that had failed them the first time, could actually go online and could do credit recovery online. And last year in Houston, we recovered over 9,000 lost course credits. The software program that we use is accredited by the Western Association of Colleges and Schools, and we're pleased with it. We began each one of our school years after the first 10 days of school on a Saturday. We do a big walk dropout recovery program. The kids who have dropped out of our schools and have not returned, we actually go door to door and knock on doors, ask kids, why are you not in school? What can we do to get you back in school? And this past year, during my tour, we knocked on 6 doors. 1 kid was absent. The 5 students we talked to, first of all, if you could see the level of poverty they lived in, it would shock you. The second thing that we learned is that many of the kids only needed a half a unit of credit or 1 unit of credit to graduate from high school. Many had already passed all their exit exams. They just were tired, and they didn't want to go back to a traditional school day where they had to sit for 7 periods and sit there all day long and take 6 courses they didn't need. They were usually older, they were embarrassed. What's fascinating about it, in most states, the kids, if they come back to school for just 1 period or 2 periods, school systems do not get state funding for those kids, so it's an extra cost. And so a lot of states don't really put a lot of emphasis on trying to get those kids back. Our place, we don't care that it costs extra. As a matter of fact, we tell the kids, you don't have to come stay all day. You can come and stay 1 period. We will work your schedule, so you can be here first period, or you can be here the last period, or you can come have lunch with us and go to school the period before, the period after lunch. Finally, what we are doing in Houston, and I could talk about this all day because we're doing so many different things, but the things we're doing are strategic. They're well thought out. They're strategies that build on each other. They're not just shots in the dark. We know that there's no one silver bullet to address this issue. But one of the things that we have done in 6 of our high schools this year, we've started a pilot program where we work with the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we identified vocations, avocations in the Houston area, jobs that are going to be there 15, 20 years from now that require at least a 2-year associate's degree. We talked about student engagement, giving kids a reason to stay in school. Jobs like pharmacy tech, x-ray technician, logistics tech. And so in these 6 high schools, we established this year a pilot, 50 different slots for kids. So 10th graders would compete for those 50 slots to be a pharmacy tech at their particular high school. The kids that were selected, they're somewhere between their 10th and 11th grade. They go to a 2-session summer school, a double session. And the courses they take are blended learning online courses through the community college. We hire a teacher who tutors and mentors them. And those particular students, when they get into the 11th grade, half their courses are taught by our teachers and half are online courses through the community college. Another double session summer school between grades 11 and 12. 12th grade, again, half and half taught by our professors and our teachers and half by the community college professors. And then the year they graduate from high school, they come back to school, and another double session summer, they have completed a 2-year associate's degree at no cost, and they have their senior year engaged in mentorship and shadowing programs, and our goal is to have them all job opportunities when they leave high schools. We've been in school 25 days. The attendance of the students in the program so far has just been phenomenal. It has just absolutely been phenomenal. And then the last thing, and we'll talk about this on another panel, is we've been engaged in this program with Dr. Roland Fryer from Harvard to turn around our 20 lowest performing schools. Because when you look at where kids drop out of school, you do find that you have middle schools and high schools, and yes, some elementary schools, where you have a higher percentage of kids leaving those schools than you do in other schools. And a lot of that comes back to having a quality teacher in every classroom. And that is a huge, huge goal of our Board of Education. Our board is so serious about this issue that I can't tell you how proud I am of them for their willingness to let us engage in some pretty creative approaches.
Thank you. Sounds like you guys have a lot of innovative ideas there. So our next star study discussant is Elena Silva, who is a senior associate at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. And when we talked briefly before this morning, I was reminded, I assume this has been attributed to every single American president, but the one I've heard said about is Andrew Jackson, when told that the Supreme Court had issued some law or rule, said, well, why don't you tell the Supreme Court to come down here and enforce it? And I believe your view on compulsory schooling laws might have something to do with that, but I will let you speak for yourself.
Sure. Well, excuse me. Let me begin by saying, Phil, I very much enjoyed your paper. I think it's fantastic analysis. And there are certain pieces of it that I very much support. I also think it's the right problem. This is certainly the right problem to be tackling. We can't have a third of our nation's children dropping out, and we know what happens if you drop out. You end up in low-wage, inconsistent work, or no work at all. So again, this is the right thing to tackle. And it makes sense to target the problem or target the solution where we think or where we see it happening. So we see 15 to 18-year-olds dropping out of school, and we want to stop that. We want to stem the tide. But we need to consider the root of the problem. So let's consider that problem for a minute. There are a lot of reasons why kids drop out, but the typical dropout actually is more predictable than perhaps we once thought it was. We know these dropouts. You imagine a kindergartner, I have one at home, super excited about school, loves school, really eager. Third grader, by third grade, you've got this student, I have one of those too, who at this point should be reading, maybe starting to get engaged, or maybe starting to get disengaged. At this point, as you move forward, you start to see kids who are going to drop out. It's pretty clear who they are. And there's a lot of research to back this up. By middle school, these kids are pretty disengaged. They're not showing up at school all the time, or not showing up for their classes. By high school, by let's say 9th grade, they fail an English class or they fail a math class. Those kids are going to drop out. We know that those are the dropouts. And so the question here is where that problem really starts. And the research, so Johns Hopkins, for example, Bob Balfans and Nettie Leckers and other colleagues there have done quite a bit of research that shows exactly how we can notice and track these indicators. The ABCs, attendance, behavior, course completion, and course progress. Those are the 3 things that you look at to find out if a kid is going to drop out. And we can do this as early as middle school. Okay, if one of those indicators is off track, by the time a kid's in 6th grade, the chances that that child's going to graduate plummets. Which means, all of that is to say that we can know, we can identify, and we can do something about the dropout track. And there's been a lot of good work out there. Many of the programs that Terry just referenced, there are ways to prevent dropouts. There are ways to identify these kids early. There's a recent research paper out by Donald Hernandez, I believe it is, at Hunter College, that tracks tracks graduation all the way back to 3rd grade, proficiency in 3rd grade. If you're not reading proficiently by 3rd grade, your chances of graduation drop. If we know that, we should start targeting it there. We should be putting our efforts there. We should be focused on how to make sure that the kids at the earliest ages, that we can identify what they need and we can target interventions that work for those kids. The strength of this proposal is that it recognizes that. So if you read it carefully, and I encourage everybody to read it, it does combine both this raising of the age requirement with a lot of supports. My issue primarily with that is that the focus on requirement, which is in turn about enforcement, is about changing behavior through a mandate. That's not primarily the way behavior changes. I'm a sociologist by background, so we differ a little bit the way we come at this, but behavior, particularly with disengaged youth, doesn't change because you require them to do something. I imagine that there are some students, and there's some evidence to support this, that would feel that pressure and might stay a little longer because they feel that pressure. Although developmentally, the later you get in those years, the less likely it is that they're going to respond actually to that pressure. But even if there are some students who will respond to that pressure, by and large, I think we'd see high rates of noncompliance, that it wouldn't really change student behavior, that we wouldn't really see states enforce it at that point. We're not really going to see states fine families and give fines to students. And if they did, I don't think it would be effective. So it's not actually the idea that kids should graduate from high school that I would take issue with. I think the federal government should send a very strong signal. Every single state, every single district, every single school should send a strong signal that graduation, high school graduation, is necessary. It's the minimum. And we should send that signal in a lot of different ways. But we've seen a lot of states try to do this, try to raise and focus on compulsory age requirements. A lot of them haven't gotten there. It's politically difficult to do. It's practically difficult to do. And my biggest concern is just that we have other places where we could be focusing our energies. There are ways to prevent dropouts. We know what those are, and those ways actually improve the quality of education, the quality of instruction. It changes what happens inside schools. It's not about the outside requirements. It's not about time requirements. It's about actual learning and instruction inside schools. It's a problem we're solving, absolutely, but there are specific pathways, I think, to solve this. We should establish early indicator and intervention systems. We should tackle chronic absenteeism, which is very related. Well, why isn't chronic absenteeism a performance measure for schools? Well, why don't we track that? If we did, we would know. It's one of the ABCs. We would know, and we would be able to individualize and personalize instruction and support for the kids who need it, and then they wouldn't drop out. We can design alternative pathways to graduation, and that's in relationship, I think, to what Terry was saying. There are a lot of different ways that kids are approaching learning, particularly at that age. We're in a place and a time now with technology and data systems and blended learning where we can provide education in a lot of different places, in a lot of different formats that will engage kids. Those are the things I think we should be focusing on.
Thank you. We're incredibly fortunate to have Dennis Van Roekel with us as well. He's the president of the National Education Association, which I learned represents more than 3 million public school employees and is the largest labor union in America. Previous to that, he was a teacher for 23 years, mathematics?
High school math, yes.
High school math. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, if we have a bunch of new students staying in school, or students staying in school longer, presumably, I think we'll probably have to have more teachers. And if these are students who are maybe less excited about school, how that might affect the dynamics of teaching in the classroom.
Well, let me first say thank you for the opportunity to be here. And as a 23-year high school math teacher, this is a fun topic to be talking about. Quick points about the report. I thought it was excellent. And the first point I'd make is that NEA has long supported extending the compulsory age to 18, but I think a really important thing, and Terry said it so well, it's not more of the same. If the solution was only to do the same thing longer, we would have done that a long time ago. And the idea that you have to do something differently to impact these kids and keep them in school and have success, that's a really important point. And in the report, it talks about raising a national expectation that everyone has to have at least a high school diploma. That's really important. You can't mandate that, but by your behaviors and actions, you can create that kind of an atmosphere. They point out very clearly that it isn't just one policy change. The second aspect of the report that I think is so critical is the point when it points out that the benefits so outweigh the cost. Education, I think it's wrong when we talk about the cost of education. It isn't a cost to me at all. It truly is an investment. And when you look at all the economic studies that show the difference in lifelong learning or earnings, it's very evident that the investment you make in having a well-educated workforce and society really pays off in the long run. I think that's so critical to just start from the premise. We know it costs money, but it is an investment that pays better to the business people. It's a better ROI than any other investment you can use with tax dollars. Third aspect about impacting teachers. See, one of the things that if you put those kids who wanted to drop out and you forced them to stay in my class, oh, that'd be a problem. But if you create an environment where they want to be, at Education Nation, I saw a video, and I'm going to go there to visit. It's Worcester, Massachusetts, and it's their tech high school. It's unbelievable. They have 24 different career choices. They have on-site, they have a veterinarian clinic where kids actually work on live animals, not stuffed ones, a 16-bay auto shop, and the list just goes on. But it's the different, not more of the same. But there's one thing that in the report that I think, although it wasn't the focus, it is so important, and it was mentioned by both panelists, the early intervention. See, I'm a believer in systems, that you can't take a piece of a whole system, tinker with it, or even change dramatically one piece and assume the whole thing will change. I don't believe that's true. And when you read systems theory, the thing about public education in America that's most troubling to me is when they say no system can produce anything other than what it was designed to produce. So in this country, when we graduate 75% of the kids, year after year after year, unless you're African American, Hispanic, there's closer to 50%, as the report points out, that rate doesn't fluctuate like the Dow Jones average, it's constant, because the system was designed to do that. So what we have to do is talk about what changes in the system have to occur so that we get different results. And that early intervention is absolutely the key. See, when the system was designed, by the way, nobody did anything wrong. There's no one to blame. It was a different time. They needed everyone to have a basic education. They needed some to have more, and a very small group to go on to college and get a very well-developed education. That's what the times needed, and it worked unbelievably well. In the 21st century, I don't believe that purpose of education remains the same. We can't just educate basics for all, and some get more. We're going to have to provide much more for all. So how do you change that system? How do you do the interventions? Because it's so true. They may leave in high school, but they dropped out long before that. And when I taught freshman general math versus a pre-calculus course, those are worlds apart. Because if you're a freshman in high school and you're still not even in algebra, the reason you're there is not because of math. It's because you have not been successful in math. And the idea that I, the magic teacher in ninth grade, am going to do something so remarkable that it's going to erase all of your history and now I will do well in math is crazy. But what you need to do is to focus on that student to create that connection between where they'd like to be and what I'm teaching. If I do that, the math is easy. So I think the intervention, the additional policy, is really the answer is early childhood. There is no research that exists that doesn't tell you that that's the answer. That you've got to start. There is no class in school from K to 12 that has a greater range of ability than kindergarten. The further they go, the classes get more homogeneous. But that kindergarten class, we have got to provide that for early childhood. And I think as we look at the range of public policy, that's the one we need to focus on.
Thank you. Phil, I thought you might like to have a chance to reply to some of the points that have been made. In particular, I thought you might talk a little bit about some of the historical evidence that you're drawing on and why you think that's relevant and some of the benefit-cost analysis you did.
Sure, that'd be great. And I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a great privilege to have a chance to interact and hear what you have to say. I thought that they were very good points. I think it's clear from my paper that I don't view compulsory schooling's mechanisms only through simply sending a letter saying we're going to fine you if your kid is not going to school, we're going to send you to prison. Compulsory schooling is, the issue is really about addressing engagement, as everyone's been saying, and when we see chronic absenteeism even early, that is a compulsory schooling issue. Compulsory schooling is, it's not just about never showing up to school, it's about not attending, not showing up on that day. And what I think the laws provide is a mandate for addressing disengagement, whether it be through, it provides the opportunity for schools to realize we have a problem here, not just we care about this, but we also have legislation says that we need to care about this as well. And one of the reasons why we observe when some states raise the school leaving age above 16, not only did we see high school completion rates increase, but we also saw the number of people dropping out at really early ages decrease. And I think it was because that when these policies became more restrictive, they simultaneously also increased the awareness of principals and schools' need to address engagement. And as I said in the paper, I think the ways to address disengagement, there's many ways, and it does have to start early. That doesn't mean that there's no hope for addressing disengagement as starting late. In another series of studies, I've shown that providing simple assistance in filling out the college application form is enough to make the difference between many people going to college or not. There are opportunities for nudges, even at later stages, which can make the difference even for these older kids. At the same time, that doesn't mean that we don't address early disengagement, we address both. So I think that's the main point I want.
Jerry, I know Texas they already have a age 18 compulsory schooling law. Is that relevant in the way you run the Houston district?
Texas is a 16-year.
Oh, 16.
16. Quite frankly, I wish it were 18. I'm a proponent of having a higher graduation standard. I understand everything she said. I can get on both sides of that coin and argue both sides. And certainly, engagement is a big key. The interesting thing is, most of us in education know what the problem is. We even have a reasonable idea about the solution. What bothers me is that we don't have more people that are passionate about addressing it. I really think that this ought to be a national imperative for all of us to really address with vigor. The hard piece becomes the end. We've got our dropout rate down to 11.5%. The low-hanging fruit's gone. Now the hard work is in front of us. And to me, if having an 18-year compulsory attendance law would help me get that 11.5% down to 10, it's worth it. Now you say, well, gee whiz, how are we going to enforce it? How do we enforce it now? How do we enforce it now? We have kids that drop out of school in Houston before they're 16. Go try to find them and see where they are and try to enforce that. And we have that as an issue too. So, you know, yeah, I understand how hard it would be to enforce, but it's hard to enforce the 16-year. And if it's, to me, if it's just one more tool in the toolkit, then I think it's worth, if it saves another 1%, 2%, it's well worth that.
If I could just respond, I think that's right. I wouldn't disagree with that, but policy, I think as we all know, is about making choices. It's about picking the policy that's going to have the greatest impact on this problem, a problem that we all agree needs to be solved. My sense is that a lot of the interventions that you spoke of are where the policy should hit. And that if we focus instead on the compulsory age, again, send the signal. There's a lot of ways we can send the signal. It's not politically easy to pass this. This isn't an easy slam dunk. And so if that's the case, we're going to focus our efforts and our attention on raising the compulsory age. I think that's the wrong place for us to focus. I also think it sends a message while signaling that high school graduation is important. It also sends the message that is actually the attainment of that competence, of that certification, of graduation. And so we do need to ask what that means. Is graduation the right measure? Because to your point about 16-year-olds, there's plenty of 18-year-olds who graduate from high school who employers are not pleased with. They don't have the skills they need, they don't have quality education, they are unprepared. So if we are going to focus on anything, it needs to be ensuring that they're actually learning. This is why our nation wants a different state, well, except Texas, right? This is why we're engaged in this project, to try to have higher, better, improved standards to do just that.
It's interesting, and I just want to pop back in real quick. You just said something that just made me go like this. We have employers all over Houston, all over America that are hiring these kids. One side of their mouth says, we want kids that have higher skill sets. The other side, they're hiring these kids knowing they're high school dropouts. And I promise you, in Houston, Texas, if I could have every employer in Houston, Texas, just from a moral perspective, say that if we're going to hire a kid that's a high school dropout, we're going to insist they go back to a twilight school in the evening and finish their education. Sure. Or guess what? We aren't going to pay you. We aren't going to hire you. And when you start talking about it's hard to pass legislation, that's why it's hard to pass legislation, because you have lobbyists in the labor movement around the country that are lobbying against it because they want these kids to be able to do subpar work. I can remember in a much younger age in a small school district when I was a superintendent, and we were really attacking this dropout issue. And I had a leading citizen from the community asked to see me, and he came to see me and he said, look, I think you're working too hard on this dropout issue. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, you know, if you keep these kids in school and you try to convince them they can all go to college, who's going to work in our pulpwood factories? Who's going to run our cotton gins for us? Now, this was in a different state. It was a different time. But this has to be something we can't just sit around and say it's important as educators and as college professors. This has to be important to America. It has to be important to our employers. And once we get everybody together on the team, we're going to be able to tackle this problem with much more, I think, ease.
And I think with students, I never tried to establish that graduation was the end in sight. It was the means. It's not an end. So I used to say to my students, so what would you like to achieve in my class? And they'd say, oh, I want an A. And I'd say, that's it? Your life would be complete if you got an A in my second year algebra class? You're setting your sights way too low. Because what I have is not worth busting your buns just to get an A. But what I have, what it's worth, is where you're going. I can tell you how it'll help get you there. So as much as we absolutely support the age of 18, because they can get more of what they need to go where they want to go, we just can't make it sound like if you complete that, now you're done. You've done well. You've got a high school diploma. It is always about, it is your means of getting somewhere. And the more we can establish that and instill that in kids, that education is a means, not an end, I think we absolutely gain.
Thank you. Okay, so before we go to, I know there's a bunch of people want to ask questions. I'm going to make one suggestion. You have this stubborn 11.5%, and you have to be one of the leading reform superintendents in the country. I can guarantee you, between Phil and Roland Fryer and a series of other impressive education researchers, if you let them run some randomized control trials, you can figure out what works and what doesn't on the stubborn 11.5%, and then everyone would have the benefit of knowing that.
There's no question, and they all know me well enough to know that we're more than willing to do that, and we have been doing that. It is stubborn. It's very, very stubborn. Other thing we've done this year, we have a new teacher and a new principal evaluation instrument in Houston, and they both are weighted very heavily towards student performance. And the principal evaluation instrument includes a component on student dropouts. And at the elementary level, it contains a component on the percentage of kids reading at grade level. So again, focusing the light, being strategic about it, all of the research most of us know, it's tough, hard work, but a lot of it is political will. And believe it or not, a lot of it is working in an educational environment, at least in public schools, where you have a board of education that this is a huge priority. When I went to work in Guilford County, I can remember it like it was yesterday, when the board interviewed me for the job, I said, what is your big priority? And they basically said, dropout prevention. And I said, what percentage of your budget is committed to addressing that issue, either short-term or long-term, like we were talking about? And it was so small, it was hard to find. And so if this is a big issue for all of us, we must align our resources to address this problem. At the early age with intervention, attendance, we know in some of our schools, we know that we have problems with ninth grade attendance. You were talking about that. How many attendance incentive programs do you have in the schools where you have those kinds of problems? We all know that if you speak Spanish as a first language, if you miss 4 or fewer days each semester during kindergarten, first, second grade, at the end of the third grade, there's as much as a 38 percentage point difference in your reading scores. How much education are we doing with our Latino parents to make sure they understand the importance of their children being schooled every day at a young age? I mean, we know all of these things. The political will to do what we know sometimes may be a bigger issue here than we're willing to admit.
Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for a couple questions from the floor. And I see that there's people will be here with a microphone in a second.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. I'm John Dewey educated. He was my godfather and my mother's mentor. And it's all about learning by doing, which gives meaning. And I guess I have a question that is multifaceted. First of all, I think you're absolutely right. It's about systems. So there's not one thing you can do. But kids need to learn systems, process, context, and consequences. I can't find that in any program. And I watch it at an adult level and see why people make terrible mistakes. Texas, I was looking at this 20 years ago, sort of controls the content of the school books, right?
Yes.
So if you could start rethinking what would be put in the curriculum, which could get them to think about problem solving. A friend of mine are talking about writing books for young kids where they have to be part of the answer. You start with Sammy comes down for breakfast and there's a peach and a bowl of cereal, and Sammy asks, he's asked, where did this come from? Well, my mother got it. Well, where did she get it? Well, she had, I mean, you have to build up, you have to make learning an exciting discovery adventure. And I don't think that's being done in most schools.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, who do we have next? If you could state your name, and then given a short period of time, the more you can direct a question to one of the panelists, the better.
Hello, I'm Bob Reed with Healthy Teen Network, and a population of focus for us is expectant and parenting youth, so dropout's a very large problem for them. I wanted to hear panelists' view on kind of going the opposite direction. I was at a session on disconnected youth a few days ago where they were talking about, I think it's in Texas, where there's a state law that permits funding of using high school funding. I don't know all the details, up through age 26. And so it's honoring that the K through 12 system funding potentially should be made available for older students. I'm curious if that's not another way to think of this, rather than just trying to get to 18 as compulsory. Maybe it's about using elementary and secondary education funding for older students.
Well, there's real quick in our high school, Twilight high schools, if a student's 21, 19, 18, we don't really ask age. If they need 1 or 2 courses to be completed, they can come in and do credit recovery in those Twilight high schools and receive their diplomas, and we're very happy and proud to do that. Give me the choice between having all-day pre-K and moving money towards the 25, 26 years old kids or adults. I'm going to pick the pre-K every day. Texas last year in budget cuts eliminated funding for all-day pre-kindergarten programs. Our school district, our Board of Education, we decided to take money off the top from Title I and fund all-day pre-K across the district. That reduced Title I funding to our high schools and middle schools, but we thought it was the thing to do.
Okay, I think there's a question here.
Hi, my name is Amy. I work on Capitol Hill. I watched the Frontline documentary on Tuesday, and it was fascinating and scary, but great. I saw a lot of adults making significant efforts to intervene in children's lives, and I just wanted to know, how do you prevent burnout for these people who are doing incredible things? It seemed like they were doing just a significant amount of work to actually make things happen for these kids, but I'm not sure, can we sustain that?
It's interesting. Anyone that's done this kind of work, Seth will tell you from his democracy prep, anyone that does this kind of work burns out. Preventing burnout's not possible. What you have to do is develop networks where people know each other and care about each other as people, and they spend time talking and reinforcing each other, but burnout's going to occur.
I think the other aspect of that is not to expect all the things that his child needs to be provided be done by one person, sometimes the teacher. I know my first year of teaching, by Christmas, I went to my old hometown doctor and he thought I was developing an ulcer, because what I was doing is internalizing every single problem that a student had and taking it on. You have to learn to not do that, or you can't survive. But when we talk about the intervention programs, like an after-school program, it need not be the people who taught all day long. Then you do an intervention after school, and then you do evening work. You can't do that. Not if you have a family and you have your own children. So we've got to devise a system that I think honors the people and the work they do, but don't expect them to do something that is not sustainable. I don't think the solution is a system that burns people out and then we replace them. I think the solution is creating a system that allows people to have that passion and that commitment and do their work, and yet know that it isn't the only thing they do in their life. No one can sustain that.
And I would just add, again, just to reiterate, the early intervention, early indicators, early identification and intervention. The problem is it builds, right? So a lot of the time you're seeing the problem has been building and building and building. So anybody that's going to be trying to help these kids is dealing with a whole host of problems that might not have built to that point if we had started a little earlier.
In our dropout program, the Apollo 20 program we do with Roland Fryer from Harvard, those 20 schools, they together collectively came up with a mantra that's spreading across our district. It simply goes, together we can, which gets at this burnout issue, whatever it takes, and no excuses. And you put all three of those together and you live that, it becomes very, very powerful, whether you're talking about early intervention or whether or not you're talking about long-range strategies.
I wanted to add on the early intervention. I hate to use automobiles in comparison to kids in school, but when we first started in this country finding that we were behind in the quality race, one of the things they found in this country is that outside of the assembly line there were parking lots for all of the cars that were coming off the assembly line that weren't right and needed to be fixed. And when they went to Japan and other countries that had started this quality movement sooner, they didn't have a parking lot. And they go, well, where is it? They go, we don't have one. They go, well, what do you do with all the cars that come off the line that aren't right? And they said, we stop the line when there's something wrong. So the focus was that as you move, you take care of those situations. So the workers had the right to shut down the assembly line because a car they were working on, something wasn't right. Now, don't adopt, but adapt that to the concept of education and early intervention. Don't wait until they're all 15 and 16 and dropping out of school and create these incredible programs to try and bring them back and get them back on track. The systems that are successful, for example, in Finland, when I visited there, when a child is having trouble, they immediately have an intervention. They have a team meeting, and they determine whether this child needs a small group, whether they need a small group of adults to work with them, or whether they need one-on-one, but we deal with it right now. And I think that deals with not only intervention, but the burnout issue, because you're dealing with the issues as they come up, a far better solution.
Okay, I think we're out of time, unfortunately. We've been fortunate enough to have 4 people here who are focused on what has to be one of the nation's most important problems. 20% of our kids don't finish high school. In some groups, it's as much as a half. And if you could join me in thanking these 4 experts who put forward great ideas.